Later this year, the United States will vote for its 47th president, and from an assassination attempt to last-minute candidate changes, the race to the White House has made headlines before it's even fully begun. Behind these headlines are two candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So, when it comes to climate change, what's actually the difference between these two candidates? And what could the next president of the United States mean for the entire world? I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And today I want to talk about the climate credentials of the next president of the United States. I want to talk about this because what happens in the USA doesn't stay in the USA. The US is the biggest historic emitter, causing more climate change than any other nation. And the US hugely influences what the world does to halt global warming. The past year has been an absolute scorcher, and we're already feeling the devastation that climate change causes, from extreme weather to the spread of disease. And the tough truth is, it's already incredibly late to limit warming to relatively safe levels. At this point, every single decision matters for how livable our future will be. So let's talk about the decision that America is facing. At the time I'm recording this, it's between Republican former President Donald Trump and the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, current Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, I know what you Americans are probably thinking. Who's a Brit like you to tell us Americans who to vote for? And to that, I would say two things. Firstly, I hope you all appreciate the restraint it took to not do an American accent for that character. And secondly, my biggest audience is actually in the US. And worldwide, people are talking about Harris and Trump. I've seen some people working on climate arguing that the two candidates are somehow equivalent, and others going full brat mode in their support for Harris. So the point of this video is not to tell people who to vote for. I just feel like it's important that people know the differences between the two candidates, and that definitely includes the differences when it comes to climate change. And that's really the first thing to spell out. The two candidates are actually different. Really different. Let's look at their words first. Donald Trump has repeatedly denied basic climate science, saying things like,
"It'll start getting cooler. You just watch."
And arguing climate action harms Americans.
Leaving American workers and taxpayers to absorb the cost in terms of lost jobs, lower wages, shuttered factories.
Quick note, but Trump often argues that he opposes clean energy because he cares about jobs. But clean energy jobs already hugely outnumber fossil fuel jobs in America. Okay, but onto Kamala Harris. This is how she talks about climate change.
Climate change has become a climate crisis.
And she's argued that
when we invest in climate, we create jobs, we lower costs, and we invest in families.
Okay, so great. Harris says she believes that climate change is serious, while Donald Trump denies the fundamentals. But actions speak louder than words. And that's one thing that's great about this presidential race. We can actually look at the candidates' actions, what they've actually done when they've been in office. One of the very first things that Donald Trump did was announce the US would exit the Paris Climate Agreement.
So we're getting out.
Now, slightly hilariously, this only came into effect one day after the 2020 US presidential election, which Trump lost to Joe Biden, who then immediately rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. But even so, the departure of the world's biggest historic emitter stalled global action and upended negotiations. In fact, I was at the 2018 climate negotiations, and Trump's climate inaction was the backdrop to everything that was being discussed. And Trump didn't just change the US's role on the international stage. From approving major oil pipelines to rolling back over 100 environmental rules, Donald Trump has weakened emissions limits and reversed efficiency standards. He also had a major impact on the courts, appointing judges with anti-environment track records, including Supreme Court justices. This led to the Supreme Court ruling restricting how the Environmental Protection Agency can control CO2 emissions. After all this, Trump still claims that
I had the best environmental numbers ever.
Which is misleading at best. The improvements that were seen were generally caused by things like COVID shutdowns, pre-existing regulations, and general trends away from coal. In other words, some environmental measures improved despite Trump, not because of him. But it's hardly surprising that the man who has repeatedly called climate change a hoax isn't exactly a climate champion. The question is Kamala Harris actually any better? Well, let's look at what's actually happened over the last 4 years while Harris served as vice president to Joe Biden. Most importantly, they introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, often referred to as the IRA, much to the confusion of British people like myself. Harris cast the tie-breaking vote to pass the IRA, which pushes hundreds of billions of dollars towards reducing emissions, with subsidies for everything from solar panels to electric cars. And this is a big deal for the climate. In fact, it's often hailed as the biggest deal for the climate in US history. In terms of numbers, the Environmental Protection Agency estimates it means reducing emissions by at least a third by 2030, relative to 2005 levels. And in terms of my personal experience, I can genuinely say that many of the climate nerds that I know never thought we'd see such ambitious climate change policy from the US, regardless of political party. And speaking of shining endorsements, I feel a sponsor message coming on. Well, you feel incorrectly. I don't want to sell you all things with my videos, and so no monetization, no product placements. Videos like this are entirely supported by my amazing patrons. Join them up here, or if that's not for you, just liking and subscribing are pretty good too. Can we get back to Kamala Harris's record now? Sure, we can look further back than just her time as VP. As California District Attorney, she set up an environmental justice unit to prosecute environmental crimes in California, and that was almost 2 decades ago in 2005. And later, as Attorney General, she secured multi-million-dollar settlements on environmental violations from car companies and oil firms. She even sued none other than the Obama administration in an effort to halt new offshore fracking permits. And looking to the future, what her presidency might bring, her climate advisor has said she would focus on implementing the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's worth pointing out that when she ran for Democratic presidential nominee in 2019, her climate platform was way more ambitious than Biden's, calling for everything from a carbon tax to a ban on fracking for oil and gas on public lands. So it could be that she'd be even more of a climate champion than her predecessor if she becomes president in 2025. And while we're looking at what could happen in 2025, we have to talk about Project 2025. Project 2025 is a 900-page far-right blueprint by the Heritage Foundation for the next Conservative presidency. And it covers a lot of extremely concerning ground, from potentially criminalizing people who provide abortions to eliminating the Department of Education. Seriously, if you haven't heard of it, definitely look into it. Some links for further reading, as always, are provided below. Trump has tried to distance himself from it, even claiming he knows nothing about it. But this doesn't exactly check out. Half the blueprint's authors worked under him during his presidency, and he's mentioned in it hundreds of times. And he previously said the Heritage Foundation would detail plans for what he would do in his next presidency. But I digress. Here's what the project could actually mean for the climate. It proposes scrapping what it calls climate alarmism, but is actually vital research into the threats climate change poses and the solutions we could take. On top of that, it would increase fossil fuel extraction on federal lands and halt the National Weather Service's role as forecaster, which would halt their life-saving extreme weather warnings on everything from tornadoes to heat waves. And when it comes to pollution that directly harms the health of humans and the environment, Project 2025 takes a firm stand on the side of polluters, emphasizing costs to industry over environmental win-wins. All in all, this would mean a crisis for combating the climate crisis, and there's good reason to think it's exactly what Trump is planning. Now, don't get me wrong, Kamala Harris has overseen harmful climate policies too. The Biden-Harris administration has, for example, given the green light to the Willow project, drilling oil in the Alaskan Arctic, and fossil fuels are still receiving tax breaks. Plus, the US is still not doing its fair share to limit global warming to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees Celsius. These are the limits that would keep our planet relatively safe from the worst consequences of climate change. So I guess this is the point where you make the lesser of two evils argument. Actually, honestly, no. Because when it comes to climate change, we're still looking at a choice between a candidate who has been devastating for the climate, and one who has overseen some of the most ambitious acts to protect our environment that the US has ever seen. Just to be clear, the first one is Trump and the second one is Harris. The truth is that we have seen big steps forward from Harris, and that certainly contrasts with the giant leaps back that Trump has implemented in the past and hopes for in the future. I thought you said you weren't going to tell us who to vote for. And I'm not. The goal of this video is to point out that when it comes to climate, there are huge differences between these two potential presidents. What you do with that information is obviously your call. And of course, there are many other factors that go into who you'd vote for, or whether you'd feel comfortable to vote at all. From reproductive rights to the US economy to healthcare to the US's continued bipartisan support for Israel killing tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians. But I will say this, climate change can make us feel powerless, but we're not. Every time we raise our voices on climate change, we're shifting the mercury in the thermometer. And politics, despite its ugliness and its huge flaws, is one of our biggest opportunities to raise our voices. And if you want to know just how powerful it can be to raise our voices, then look no further than my conversation with incredible climate scientist, Katharine Hayhoe. Okay, thanks a lot for watching. Until next time. Bye. Estimates... Oh, blah, 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 blah.